Turn it up, swashbucklers! You're listening to Under the Crossbones, episode number 123. My name is Phil Johnson. I'm your host for the show. Thanks for tuning in, and Happy New Year. Here we are in 2018. Fun fact about the number 123, the first 3 days of 2018 are January 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, that's a lame fun fact, I get it. But when you Google the number 123, all you get is like things that are supposedly easy and pirate movie sites. I should say illegal movie sites, not pirate movie sites, illegal download sites. Anyway, so here we are in 2018. And I hope you had good holidays. I hope you ate a lot of food and had nice times with friends and family and all that kind of good stuff. We had nice mellow Christmas. My brother and his wife and his kid came up, so we spent some time with them. We did just dinners. We didn't do anything extravagant, but we stuck around home. We did a couple things. My girlfriend and I went to San Francisco, and in Golden Gate Park there is a lake called Stowe Lake, and they have rowboats that you can take out on the lake. And if you've listened to this show for any amount of time, you know that as much as I enjoy pirates and the people around the pirate community, I am not a seafaring individual very much. And so we took out a rowboat, and I don't think I've ever been in a rowboat before, short of maybe the Davy Crockett canoes at Disneyland. That may be my entire experience. So we took a rowboat out on Stowe Lake, and we rowed in circles. I'm not talking around the lake. I mean, spinning in a circle for about 10 minutes before we finally got the hang of it, because we each had one oar. And then we finally made our way around the lake in about 45 minutes. So, but as my girlfriend was saying, well, which way is supposed to point forward? I said the pointy part. I didn't say the bow. I said the pointy part. Pirate fail, friends. Yeah. So anyway, that was I had a little seafaring kind of thing. Oh, and we went to the Exploratorium in San Francisco, which, if you've ever been, is a very cool sciencey museum. But you may not know this. Thursday nights, adults only, from 6 to 10. Yeah, no kids in the Exploratorium, just adults playing with the science exhibits. That was cool. That was quite fun. So anyway, we did mellow stuff like that. We hung around home, and because we're saving up for a trip to Paris in March, which we bought our airline tickets for yesterday. We're very excited, so that's going to be a lot of fun. But I hope you're going into 2018 with some positivity in your head. I was thinking of this morning. Years ago, I was opening for a comedian named Ron Schock at a club in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Now, Ron is unfortunately not with us anymore. He passed away a few years ago, but he was fantastic, and we were having a great weekend at a great club, and it was like, I don't know, Saturday night late show, something like that. It was one of the shows of the week, and I looked out the crowd. We were sitting off to the side of the stage, and I said, man, this looks like a great crowd. And Ron turned to me, and he went, no. And I sort of jumped back, and I went, no? What do you mean? He said, never assume that the crowd is going to be good, or they're going to be bad, or they're going to be anything. He said, go up neutral. And your shows will improve because you never have expectations about what the audience is going to do, so you won't be caught off guard by what they do in actuality. Sometimes you see a crowd that's going to be great, and they turn out to be terrible. Or you see a crowd you think is going to be terrible, and they turn out to be great. And that, I think, is the mindset that I'm going to take into this next year. I've applied it to my shows for years, and it does absolutely work fantastic to not make prejudgments about the audience and to go up neutral. So I'm going into 2018 neutral. I have things I want to do, but those are the things I always want to do. So just because it's January 1st today, and the first week of, it doesn't matter. The goals are goals, and they're goals any time of the year. Good things are going to happen. I've got great things coming up this year. Like I said, we're going to Paris. I'm going to be seeing you at the Long Beach Pirate Invasion in the summer. I'm going to that. I've got some really fun shows booked. I'm going to be expanding in new cities. It's great stuff is going to happen. Bad stuff is going to happen too. And I don't want to be thrown by any of it. So I'm going into 2018 neutral. And I hope that maybe you will too, because I think it might be a better way to face down time. We're all getting older, and then we die. Oh, how's that for a Happy New Year's message? All right. Okay, cool. All right. I do have some shows coming up. Monday, January the 8th. That's next Monday. I will be headlining at the Mannheim Social Club in Brentwood, California. If you happen to be near there, come on out. That's the Northern California Brentwood, not the Southern California one. Sunday, January the 21st, I will be at the All Out Comedy Theater in Oakland, California. That's all I've got booked for January so far. I'm working to rectify that situation and fill the calendar a little bit, so there'll be more stuff coming up. Did you get cool Christmas presents? Did you get? I got some nice stuff. I got some really nice stuff. I got the Disney Pirates book from my brother that I got to read, and I'm going to try and talk to the author on this show, hopefully sometime soon. Maybe you got a guitar for Christmas, or maybe you just want to learn to play the guitar this year. I've got musical goals. I'm going to start working my jazz piano chops a little bit more this year. But let's say maybe you want to learn guitar this year. I have a thing that I'm doing with my guitar students called the 30-Day Guitar Challenge. So if you've ever wanted to learn how to play guitar, this is a great way to get in. It's totally free. You will learn 3 songs in 30 days with just 10 minutes of playing each day. And like literally 10 minutes of playing. I've broken it down into the babiest of baby steps for you to learn how to play 3 songs in 30 days. So if you want to learn how to play the guitar, go to underthecrossbones.com/guitar. And you can sign up for the 30-Day Guitar Challenge there. And it's a lot of fun. Everybody that's been doing it has really had a good time with it. And I think you'll like it. So again, that's underthecrossbones.com/guitar. If you would like to learn how to play the guitar from me, it's my program that I've put together. If you're enjoying the show, join us over on Facebook. That's facebook.com/underthecrossbones. On Twitter, we're at undercrossbones. That's starting to pop up a little bit. Hey, Twitter people, good to talk with you. And make sure you're subscribed to the show on whatever your podcatcher of choice is. Apple Podcasts or Spotify, Google Play, Podcast Addict, Slicker, Slacker, Stitcher. I don't know. There's probably one called Slicker out there, and I don't know about it yet. But wherever you like to listen to podcasts, make sure you're subscribed to the show. You get all the new episodes every Tuesday morning, hot off the presses. I just realized I haven't even told you who our guest is this week yet. Just yammering on, just trying to make 2018 work, man. My guest today is Marcus Rediker. I am very excited to play this interview for you because it is a really great talk. Marcus Rediker is an author of a book called Villains of All Nations and a ton of other books. He wrote the Amistad Rebellion. He wrote The Fearless Benjamin Lay. He's got a whole list of books that'll be linked up in the show notes that you can check out. But Marcus and I, we got into a really great deep discussion about pirates and all the history and issues and politics around it, and not current politics, don't worry, historical politics, slavery, all that kind of really getting into the issues of piracy and in the Golden Age. And this is a really fantastic talk. I'm very excited to be able to play this one for you. So we're going to get to Marcus Rediker in just a second, and you can find him at marcusrediker.com. Rediker is Rediker. And so we're gonna do that. All the show notes for this episode will be at underthecrossbones.com/123. So let's do it. Let's waste no more time. Let's get to my interview with Marcus Rediker. Enjoy. Ostensibly today we're going to talk about Villains of All Nations, but I know you've written a ton of books, so I want to talk a little bit about those as well. And I've gotten partway through Villains of All Nations, but I haven't been able to finish it yet. I plan to. When you are writing these books, and I don't know if this is ever a question I've asked an author before, who is your audience for these books? Are you writing for a mainstream audience or a more scholarly audience? Who do you see as your reader?
I always try to write for the broadest possible audience, but to engage a lot of different people at the same time.
Okay.
One of the things that I consider to be important is that you simply explain what you mean as you go in the text, and you don't take anything for granted. This is a lesson I learned a long time ago in one of the early books I wrote called The Many-Headed Hydra, and there was a lot of discussion at that time about whether academics could write for popular audiences. My editor said, of course you can. You just explain everything in the narrative. And I think that's a very good piece of advice, and I've tried to follow it ever since.
I like that. Basically, it's the nice way of saying, look, stupid people are going to try and read your book, so don't leave them out.
Well, no, I take almost the exact opposite point of view, which is that I think ordinary readers, just people in the general public, can be very interested in complex histories.
Sure.
And I think we underestimate them.
Okay. That makes sense too. So let's talk about Villains of All Nations for a second. For those who haven't read it, can you give us sort of a thumbnail sketch of what happens in that book?
That is a book that grew out of really research I had done over a number of years. It's about one generation of pirates in the Golden Age. And by Golden Age, I mean roughly the 1650s or 1660s up through the 1720s. Mm-hmm. And within that Golden Age, there are really three different generations of pirates.
Sure.
There are the Buccaneers in the early Caribbean. There are the pirates of the 1690s, represented by William Kidd and Henry Avery. And then you have the pirates of the 17 teens and 1720s, Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts. That third generation is the one that my book is about.
Okay.
And this is actually, I think, probably the most important generation of pirates. That's where all of the symbols of piracy come from, the skull and crossbones. So in some ways, it's an especially fascinating generation of pirates who have had a tremendous impact on our own popular culture.
Yes, definitely. I agree. And I like that you include those earlier generations sort of in that golden age too, because a lot of times when people talk golden age, that they do tend to just talk about that third generation, but right. There's more going on there for sure.
Well, and you need to know about those earlier generations because there are traditions that are passed from one of those to the next.
Yeah.
So that the culture, you might say, of piracy is something that exists over quite a number of years.
Definitely. And so the view that you take in the book is one that seems to be fairly popular among scholars now, is that these guys were an early form of democracy, that they became pirates because of the mistreatment in the merchant marines and the navies and things like that. Can you talk a little more about that idea?
Sure. I think that was probably the central idea of my reinterpretation of this generation of pirates. I first actually published that idea in the early 80s. First article I ever wrote was called Under the Banner of King Death, the Social World of Anglo-American Pirates, 1716 to 1726. And in that article, I argued against the old interpretation, which was still very strong at that time, that pirates were simply a gang of criminals and that we really need not know much more about them than that. Mm-hmm. I asked a fairly simple question in doing that research and then in expanding it into the book that became Villains of All Nations. I had a very simple question. What did pirates themselves think they were doing? What were their own understandings of their lives, of the choices they made? What were they doing when they actually constructed a new social order aboard a ship that they, for the first time, had control of? It wasn't owned by a wealthy merchant or a ship captain. It was theirs. So what do you do in that situation? How do you organize yourselves? And what I discovered is that the way they organized themselves was really fascinating. They elected their captains. They created a new position, the quartermaster, whose main job on a pirate ship was really just to keep an eye on the captain and make sure he didn't abuse his power. Mm-hmm. Pirates I saw not only elected captains, they deposed captains. If the captain abused that power, he would be in big trouble. Quickly busted back, if not, sometimes thrown overboard. It would all depend on what he did. So I was very interested in what you might call a social interpretation of piracy.
Okay.
When I was first studying in graduate school and, in my time as my formative period as a scholar, social history was a dominant thing. People were interested in ordinary working people and how they experienced history, and I applied that approach to both sailors and pirates.
Why sailors and pirates? Why did that attract you?
Well, in this period, I was doing this work originally in the middle 1970s. There was an extraordinary group of scholars in England. The most important of them was a man named E.P. Thompson. And they were doing what was called history from below, meaning history of ordinary people who were usually left out of the narratives of the past.
Okay.
And they were using legal records to reconstruct those histories, because the one of the dilemmas for the study of pirates and for the study of most any group of poor people, working people in the past, is that they don't usually create many documents of their own.
Right.
So you have to find ways in which documentation is created about them. So when I first started working on this, I discovered that pirates in particular generated a tremendous amount of documentation, because every time there was a trial about them, there would be a number of pamphlets and newspaper articles and the legal records themselves. So I thought that this was a rich trove of documents that I could use to try to get at who these pirates were and what they thought they were doing.
Okay. So was it a matter of making that choice just based on, well, here's some stuff I can work with? Or did you have an interest in pirates specifically before that? Or, I mean, did you just go, well, here's stuff I know I can work with?
Well, let me put it to you this way. I grew up in the great maritime state of Kentucky.
Okay.
And Tennessee. So you can't say that I had salt water in my veins.
Yeah.
So it didn't come to me that way. But what I was really interested in, I was part of the generation of scholars, of historians who were much influenced by the social movements of the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. And what we wanted to do was to create a more truthful version of American history. We felt like a lot of things had been left out. And basically what I wanted to do was to study those people who had been left out. Uh-huh. And I felt that pirates, sailors, working people, my later books are about slavery. I've been quite consistent in wanting to see, poor people, working class people, as not only subjects of history, but as makers of history. One of the things that interested me most about pirates was the way in which this group of, more or less common sailors who decided to cross the line into illegal activity, they created what was essentially an Atlantic-wide crisis through their capture of ships. And there were only a few thousand of them, but they really made a lot of noise in the world and had a dramatic cultural impact. So I wanted to see how these people influenced the course of history. How did they shape it? How did they direct it? How did they contribute to it? So in that sense, I guess I was kind of lucky in picking sailors and pirates, because they did prove to be just the kinds of subjects I was looking for. Okay,
great. Do you think the pirates themselves saw themselves as, do you think they saw themselves in that view as sort of the liberators and freedom fighters that we look at them as now, or were they just a bunch of guys that didn't trust each other and so they made rules that reflected that?
Well, I think both things are true, but as to the first part of your question, how did they see themselves? I found evidence, and I can still remember the moment I found it, of a group of pirates. I think it was Sam Bellamy's ship coming up alongside a merchant vessel, and the captain of that vessel later testified that they were saying that they were Robin Hood's men.
Oh, really?
Now that, I think, is a pretty remarkable piece of evidence.
Sure.
They saw themselves as robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. Now, it was certainly a convenient matter that they themselves were the poor, but that was a pretty self-serving piece of logic. But there's also other abundant evidence, which I cite in Villains of All Nations, that pirates did consider themselves to be avengers of all of the wrongs committed against common sailors. And that actually makes a lot of sense, because most of these guys had been common sailors themselves. They had experienced these brutal captains. They had gotten the poor quality food. They had been lashed and flogged. They had been paid low wages. They were bilked of their wages, and they were angry about it. So it didn't surprise me at all once I was sort of onto this theme, to see that when pirates took a merchant ship, one of the first things they would do is enact a ritual. They called it the distribution of justice. And what this meant was they would call all of the sailors of the captured ship up on deck, and the captain would be there with a pirate basically constraining him on both sides. And the quartermaster, it was usually the quartermaster of the pirate ship who would do this, would say to the members of the captured ship, the sailors, is, how does your captain treat you?
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is a pretty dramatic moment because it's pretty clear that if these sailors step up and say, our captain treats us very badly, that captain is in serious trouble.
Right.
because the pirates will take vengeance. They might tie a captain up in the very same place where he flogged his sailors and give him a flogging. So this kind of thing, I think, is pretty strong evidence that there was a social consciousness among pirates, that they came from a particular social world, and it really influenced the things that they did.
Was there any communication to the authorities back in these various nations that were controlling the empires all over the place that's why they were becoming pirates? They, if we were treated better, if we were treated better, we wouldn't do this.
Definitely. This is actually part of the intelligence that the the Board of Trade, for example, the leading regulatory agency in Great Britain, they're getting letters from colonial governors who say this kind of thing all the time. They're reading the pamphlets. I mean, there's the case of a really interesting case that takes place in Boston in 1726. A man named William Fly and his crew of pirates were captured, and they were thrown in jail. They're preparing to be executed. This is going to be a really big event. I mean, the whole town and even people from outside the town will show up to see this. And so a very famous Puritan minister, Cotton Mather, goes in to speak with these pirates to try to save their souls. Well, what he didn't realize is that in William Fly, he had someone who was going to engage him in quite a furious debate. So Cotton Mather approaches William Fly and says, you must repent for all the terrible things you've done. And William Fly says, we poor sailors can't have justice done us. Mm-hmm. Our captains treat us like dogs. So he gets right in the face of Cotton Mather and says, this is not a matter of repentance. This is a matter of justice. And what pirates do when they take vengeance against these kinds of ship captains, that's justice. So this is a really interesting moment in which everybody will show up at the hanging, many of them in the hope of hearing the pirate who's about to be executed curse the governor, curse all the gentlemen who are there, and basically say that this whole thing is wrong. Poor people can't have justice. That's a very, very common thing in these pirate executions. And I think that, too, is very revealing.
Do you think in the long span of history, then, did those maritime companies fix themselves in a very short time, or did it take longer than it should have?
Well, we know it took a long time because the golden age of piracy lasts for about 60 or 70 years. Uh-huh. In other words, people are willing to turn pirate quite frequently in that time. But I'd say that, even though piracy itself is, I wouldn't say it's exterminated because it continues to exist in various localities around the world. It can't. See, the problem is these authorities, like the authorities of the British Empire or the French Empire or the Dutch Empire, they cannot control the vastness of maritime space. Uh-huh. They just can't. I mean, there just aren't enough warships to eliminate piracy in all these places. So it is true that the grand scale deep sea piracy is kind of, for quite a number of years, is more or less eliminated. But piracy itself goes on. But my argument is that many of the ideas, especially the ideas of equality and democracy that pirates embodied, those ideas are basically pushed back down below deck among common sailors. Mm-hmm. And those ideas will arise again in other circumstances. For example, the coming of the American Revolution. A lot of sailors played a leading role in that, and I see a continuity between the ideas of the pirates and the ideas of sailors in that era. And then again, in the 1790s, there is a massive outbreak of naval mutiny in the British Navy, the French Navy, the Dutch Navy. These are the biggest navies in the world. Sure. And there are huge numbers of mutinies, and a lot of the ideas expressed in that time period have some continuity to the era of sailors' ideas in the American Revolution, and even in the era of sailors and pirates' ideas in the early 18th century. So there's kind of you won't call it an underground because we're talking about water, but there's this sort of lower deck continuity where a lot of the ideas of the era of pirates survives and goes on really for a very long time.
Interesting. Do you see some of those ideas still continuing on now, and do any of them figure into, say, the piracy in North Africa and places like that we have?
Yeah. Okay. Let me take that idea in two parts. There are major continuities, I think, in this. I'd call these the ideas of maritime radicalism, the ideas that you see among pirates. Well, let me give you an example. In 1747, there is an effort in Boston, Massachusetts, to come ashore, a naval vessel, a big naval vessel, captained by a commodore named Knowles, comes ashore to impress sailors. In other words, he's going to capture them and take them on board his ship. It's almost like a slaving operation, frankly. And the sailors are furious about this. They are furious. So they basically form these, they riot against the press gang, and there's fighting in the streets. And these sailors are actually expressing their own ideas about freedom as they resist the press gang. Well, a very important man named Samuel Adams, who will become one of the leaders some 20 years later in the American Revolution, is watching all this. And he writes in his newspaper, he says, basically, all people are on a level, all people are created equal, and therefore people must sometimes fight for their rights. Okay, that's an idea that he expresses in 1747. That idea appears as the opening sentence of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. All people are created equal, endowed by their creator with inalienable rights, and this is the justification for rebellion. So what I've argued in this book called The Many-Headed Hydra is that the radical ideas of pirates and sailors expressed themselves in 1747 in Boston, and thereby helped to form one of the main ideas of the coming American Revolution. Okay. So there again is that sort of secret life of these ideas and how they pass from one time to another. Now, the second part of your question, are there connections to contemporary piracy? I think there are, and this is very interesting, although it's also very complicated. Several years ago, when piracy in East Africa and the Straits of Malacca in Asia was quite intense, I was getting a lot of phone calls from journalists wanting me to comment on this, and they would always have a presupposition in their questioning. They would basically want me to say, please tell us that these pirates today really aren't anything like those pirates back in the Golden Age. You know, those are the good pirates and these are the bad pirates. and I would say, actually, they have a lot in common with them. They were poor people. Most of these pirates in Somalia are from very poor fishing villages.
Sure.
Actually, fishing villages that have been made poor by European fishing fleets, which have overfished the waters that those communities depended on. So I would basically say, look, there are very significant, commonalities in these two instances of piracy, and we need to think about them in that way.
It's not the kind of lifestyle that somebody would choose, except for in rare occurrences like Stede Bonnet and people like that who did choose it. But it's born out of a desperation. There's something going wrong, and we need to fix that, essentially, right?
Yes. Now, this is an important point that I emphasize in Villains of All Nations. What you have in that period is the 17 teens and 1720s is some people are choosing to be pirates knowing that they're probably going to be caught and executed. But what they're saying basically is that we would rather be free for a couple of years than be forced to live in the way that we normally are forced on board these merchant and naval ships. In other words, our prospects for life are so poor to begin with. See, this is actually reflected, Phil, in the symbolism of the pirate flag.
Okay.
You know, the skull and crossbones, which is very famous, the skull and crossbones on the black flag. In Villains of All Nations, I talk about the origins of that symbolism. And it actually is a very interesting comment on the consciousness of sailors who become pirates. And here's what I mean by that. It was very common in that period, in the early 18th century, for a captain who kept a log, a ship's log, to make a notation in writing every time a sailor died, and that notation was a symbol.
Okay.
It was a skull and crossbones written into the log, meaning this day a sailor died. So what I thought was fascinating was that sailors seized upon that symbol of death, right? A symbol of their own premature death as working sailors, and put that on their flag, whereon it had a double meaning. The one meaning was the black flag goes up when a pirate ship is chasing a vessel it wants to capture. The black flag goes up, and basically it means surrender or die, right? We will kill you if you don't give up. And that was, that was quite consciously a symbol of terror to try to force people to give up. But I've argued in the book that it says something else too. Because it turns out the skull and crossbones is not the only symbol on a lot of pirate flags. I'm sure some of your listeners know that in many instances, pirate flags had an entire skeleton, not just a skull and crossbones. And in one hand of the skeleton, there might be a dart, some kind of a weapon. It might be piercing a heart, and 2 or 3 drops of blood come out. And in the other hand of the skeleton, there is usually an hourglass, meaning time is limited. Now, that could mean you, as our prospective prey, your time is limited. You better give up. But I've argued that these symbols on the pirate flag also refer to the consciousness of sailors who felt trapped in these death machines, these ships in the merchant navy and the merchant shipping industry and the navy, places of poor food, places of violence, places of limited time, places of death, and that what pirates were doing in putting those things on the flag was essentially commenting on their own social situation as sailors and saying, now we're going to fight back under the banner of King Death. It's really ironic and kind of fascinating for that. We're going to fight for life under the symbols of death. And this is also part of the pirates' very common practice of kind of looking death in the eye and laughing.
Right.
It's that kind of rebellious laughter. Whatever you're afraid of, I'm that. Up until the early 18th century, people who were pirates would always pretend that they weren't. They would say, oh, I'm a privateer. Oh, I'm this, I'm that. The pirates of the early 18th century said, yeah, I'm a pirate. Deal with it. That's your problem. That's, we affirm that image. We are pirates and we will fight under this flag of our own. But that flag has a kind of double-edged meaning.
That's a really interesting take on it. How do you figure in some of the less socially conscious and more bloodthirsty guys that were out there, Lolane or somebody like that, who was really out like killing way more people than he probably needed to?
Yeah, that's I do think there is definitely a bloodthirsty element in piracy. Some of this happens in the in the 17th century, but it even happens at the end of the third generation of pirates, where people like Ned Lowe become so violent that he actually gets deposed by his own crew. And my explanation for that is basically, I've talked about this in the book, that as it became clear that more and more pirates are being hanged, this situation between the authorities of the British and French empires, the royal governors, the Board of Trade, and the pirates who are still out, it really becomes a war. And in the process of waging that war, some of the pirates become just pathologically violent. And this is not really altogether surprising. Another example of this, I've mentioned that this distribution of justice, of disciplining the captains who mistreated their crews, even this could go to extreme lengths. There was a pirate named Philip Line, who was executed, I think, in 1726. And on the gallows, he confessed that he had killed dozens of ship captains. This was a man who was so full of rage about probably something that happened in his own life. We don't really know enough to be able to ascertain that, but was so full of rage that he killed a lot of ship captains. Well, this in a way was a symbol that piracy was kind of in its own death throes. It was kind of at the end, and you do find this really bloody tail end to the story. But that, of course, has got to be put alongside the hundreds of pirates who were being executed. And that also fueled the rage. I mean, one of the really fascinating things is that pirates would take a ship from Boston in the Caribbean and say, you're from Boston? Well, Boston, the authorities in Boston have been hanging pirates, so we're going to punish you for that. Because the authorities in your city are hurting our brothers. So there's rage because the authorities are killing so many pirates. And so the whole thing really does get to be quite violent at the end.
I would also imagine that just any group that exists on the fringes of society, whether that's pirates or rock bands or whatever it is, you're going to draw some psycho nut jobs at some point who are going to take advantage of the situation.
I think it is true that some people who were drawn to piracy were even psychotic, and that what they wanted was to escape all constraints in landed society. Many people probably felt they had been mistreated, and they were probably damaged people. But what impressed me, actually, Phil, was that pirates created their own social order in which there were real limitations placed on that kind of behavior. In other words, pirates, once they were at sea, they could have basically erected a social order with no rules. But in fact, I'm sure you've read the articles. They had very interesting and very complex social rules about how, for example, to handle violence at sea, where they would make the people who, people fight on ships all the time because there's not enough space. Nerves are frayed, and these tensions fester. So what pirates would do is say, okay, if you have a problem, the next time we come to land, you'll go ashore and fight it out. Don't fight on the ship. We're going to symbolically take the conflict off the seas and onto the land. So they did their best to constrain that kind of violence, to make sure that it wasn't disruptive of the world they were trying to build.
That makes sense. Now, you've done a lot of writing about slavery over the years, too. How do you figure, because pirates are also dealing in slaves, how do you reconcile those two concepts?
Well, some are dealing in slaves and some are not.
Mm-hmm.
What I found is that the pirates who are in the Indian Ocean, they move into the Indian Ocean in the 1690s, and some of them actually stay there and become slave dealers in places like Madagascar.
Uh-huh.
That's one group of pirates, but the pirates who are based in the Caribbean are really, well, at least in the period that I studied. I think in the earlier period there are some pirates involved in slave trading.
Mm-hmm.
They're not doing that kind of thing, and in fact they're doing something else which is itself very interesting. They are welcoming Africans as members of their crew.
Sure.
So this is something that people frequently ask me about. How do you explain the fact that on most every pirate ship in the 17 teens and 1720s, there are lots of black pirates? Well, I think one thing that helps to explain that is that when pirates are looking for new crew members, one thing they want as much as anything else is somebody who's going to be loyal to the group.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to tell you that a runaway slave would be one of the most loyal people you could ever find.
I'm sure.
Because they don't want to go back to what they've run away from.
Yeah.
A second thing they looked for was who could fight. I mean, who could really play an important part in these battles that they had at sea?
Uh-huh.
And it turns out that a lot of Africans, including a lot of the Africans who ended up on plantations in the New World, were trained warriors, were trained soldiers. So they had a lot of martial skill. So I think this is another thing that mattered. I don't think pirates necessarily set out to create a racially equal society, but by virtue of the way that they organized themselves, there was a lot of freedom for black pirates as well as white.
Interesting. And I didn't realize that there was a geographic differentiation to where there was slave trading happening and not.
Well, this is certainly true in the 1690s and 17 teens. You'll also find in that period that quite a number of the pirates are attacking ships on the coast of West Africa.
Okay.
And that they had a very disruptive effect on the slave trade. What I discovered in my research is that they didn't want to capture ships that were full of slaves, although I think a few did. What they wanted was to capture those vessels as they're on their way to trade in slaves, because those vessels are full of provisions.
Uh-huh.
They're large ships. They're full of trade goods, which might also be very valuable to the pirates. And it turns out that pirates liked converting slave ships to pirate ships.
Sure.
This is a very interesting fact. Partly it has to do with the size. It has to do with the fact that pirate ships were pretty crowded. There was a lower deck on slave ships where people could stay. So it is very significant that pirates played a leading role in disrupting the slave trade, and it was actually slave trading merchants who led the campaign to get the Royal Navy to patrol those areas and to eliminate piracy as a real problem in the economy of that era. Probably the biggest and most important battle in the war against the pirates was when British naval ships had this face-off with the fleet of ships under the command of Bartholomew Roberts. Mm-hmm. Now, it turns out that one of the reasons why the naval vessels won that battle was because the pirates were too drunk to fight. This is another thing about having, feasting and food and drink all the time. You weren't always ready in case your enemies should appear. But that was in some ways, that was in 1722, that battle. A lot of Robert's crew were captured. Dozens of them were hanged. That whole convoy was sent out under the influence of slave trading merchants, and that was in some ways the turning point in the battle against piracy when the imperial authorities got the upper hand.
Huh. That's interesting. So in the long run, do we look at these guys as heroes, villains, or some mixture of both?
I think that it's really fascinating to see why, and to ask the question why pirates have such a positive image in contemporary society. Mm-hmm. And I think there are several reasons why. One is that piracy so inflamed the imagination of so many people. And this is actually going on as piracy itself is happening. In the 17 teens and 1720s, there's already a kind of romantic view of pirates emerging as these people who got out there and lived these lives of freedom and fought against the authorities of the day. And I think an awful lot of working class people really admired them for that reason. There were a lot of people who would love to have had a chance to join a pirate ship, but never got close enough to one to be able to do it. And this is why they would show up at these hangings, and their sympathies were actually with the pirates, not with the authorities who were hanging them. There was a case in Jamaica where a rowdy crowd at a hanging actually broke through and rescued the pirates who were about to be hanged.
Wow.
Rescued them from the soldiers and the people who were trying to put them to death. So this is one reason why I think people think of pirates as basically people who fought back. Uh-huh. Now, what happened was another thing that had a big impact on this positive image is that people like Robert Louis Stevenson began to write about pirates for children.
Sure.
Now, pirates were kind of tamed in doing this. You know, you've got Peter Pan, you've got all these children's movies. Uh-huh. But what it means now is that children grow up with these images of pirates kind of deep in their subconscious.
Right.
You know, they've seen pirate films and they have, pirate action figures and all these things. So, and that I think predisposes people to a very positive view of pirates. So what I find really extraordinary about this, Phil, is that pirates lost the battle in the 17 teens and 1720s. Many of them were hanged. But if you look at the long term of this, they won the war because pirates are celebrated today and the people who hanged them are not.
Yeah, that's true.
So this is true in pirate movies and all the rest of it. And this is a really fascinating thing. I might mention I've actually had some pretty serious discussions trying to make a pirate film, a historically authentic pirate film, based on Villains of All Nations.
Ah, interesting.
And this would be the first film that really was based on genuine research and really tried to see pirates as they saw themselves. We haven't succeeded in making that film yet, although Lionsgate did take an option on that book for a couple of years, and it may still happen. So all your readers can know that there will hopefully be a better option out there than Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, because I mean, bringing up the pop culture thing, the current pop culture view of pirates seems to be the lovable rogue. He's still a bad guy. He's still a criminal. They don't really put that freedom fighter element into the pop culture stuff. Have you seen anywhere where that's happening? Except for maybe Black Sails probably comes the closest.
Black Sails comes the closest, and I dare say that a fair amount of what is in there on that score came out of my book. But I think Johnny Depp is brilliant in this series, and he is this kind of lovable rogue. But we still don't get very much about who these common sailors were who became pirates, and that was actually going to be sort of the main point of the film that I actually still hope to make. It would basically follow a couple of common sailors, and you see what their lives are like, and you see why they made the decision to become pirates. You see how they organize themselves. You see the equality. You see the democracy. That kind of thing, I think we still have not fully understood, right. And Hollywood is still kind of standing in our way for all that.
Yeah, so something that's a little more in the tone of, say, Master and Commander than Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yeah, Master and Commander has real research behind it, but I don't always agree with the interpretation. Here's the comparison I would make. One thing we've seen over time is the evolution of war movies, which once upon a time were basically about heroic cliches, and eventually became about the hellish experience of the common soldier.
Sure.
I think we could see pirate movies moving in a similar way, where we could finally get to the point of the experience of the common sailor who becomes the pirate and really see it from below, so to speak, and really have some serious history in there and understand piracy, therefore, much more deeply.
That would be, I would watch that. I think that would be fantastic. So what are you working on these days? Since you told me you're not writing about pirates much anymore because you said all you could say on that. So what are you working on now?
Yeah, that is true. Villains of All Nations was sort of my swan song. I studied pirates on and off for about 25 years by the time I wrote that book, and and people still write me about it, and I say it's all there. It's in the footnotes. Everything I know is in that book. So I send them to the book. But since then, I've written a book about the slave trade called The Slave Ship, A Human History. I've written a book about the Amistad Rebellion, famous slave revolt that took place on a vessel off the north coast of Cuba in 1839. This was the subject of a film by Steven Spielberg called Amistad. My version of the story is very different because it's looked at from below, from the point of view of the slave rebels who captured the ship.
Interesting.
So there's that book. I brought out a collection of essays a couple of years ago called Outlaws of the Atlantic, and it's got work on piracy in it, but it's also got essays about other kinds of resistance at sea, mutinies, that sort of thing. And then my most recent book, which came out just 2 months ago, is about an 18th century abolitionist, one of the first people to demand an end to slavery. And as it turns out, his name was Benjamin Lay. The title of the book is The Fearless Benjamin Lay. He was a sailor for 12 years. And so one of my arguments in that book is that he too developed this ethic of solidarity on the lower deck, and he ended up applying that sensibility, that compassion, that solidarity to enslaved Africans and demanding abolition before really hardly anybody else had done it. It turns out this man was also a dwarf, but at the same time, one of the most militant opponents of slavery you will ever find. So that book is out now. And my next book, which I'm just beginning, is going to be a study of really work at sea in the age of sail. And my shipmate for that voyage, it's going to be like a voyage, will be Herman Melville, who actually went to sea for 5 years himself and wrote these magnificent books like Moby Dick. So I'm going to basically use Melville's novels and his experience to try to tell a broader story about what it meant to work on the high seas in the era of tall ships.
Oh, that should be interesting. I was just reading Chuck Klosterman's new book, in which he sort of has a meditation on Herman Melville as a failed author in his own time that didn't really become appreciated until much, much later, and what that speaks to for the future of who we'll remember and all that kind of stuff. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, Melville was a man who was not appreciated in his own era, but I think now we really see him as one of the greatest writers of fiction in all of modern history.
Yeah.
So I've been rereading all his novels, and I must say he really knew what he was talking about.
Interesting. So where's the best place online for people to keep up with all the stuff you're working on?
I have a website. It's marcusrediker.com.
Okay.
And it's got, excerpts from all my books. It's got lectures, video lectures that I've given on a variety of subjects, including piracy. There are 2 or 3 in there on piracy.
Uh-huh.
And, really all the things that I do. I also have a Facebook page, and I would invite people to check those out.
Fantastic. Well, I will make sure that is all linked up in the show notes, as well as links to all the books and all that kind of good stuff. Is there anything I forgot to ask you about that you want everybody to know?
Yeah, I guess for people who like piracy, I just think you have to understand the real history.
Sure.
And I came across a lot of really extraordinary documents that had never been used before in the study of piracy. And I will conclude with one story.
Okay.
This is something that happened to me when I first arrived in London. Must have been around 1979 to do research that would eventually become my first book, and then Villains of All Nations. And so I've ordered a box of documents at what was then called the Public Record Office. It's now called the National Archives. And these are trial records about sailors and pirates. There are things about wage disputes. There are trials for piracy. There are murder claims. There are all kinds of legal records. This is something called the High Court of Admiralty.
Okay.
And I get a box of these papers. It's a big, deep box, and I open it. And on the top, there's a big stack of papers, and on the top of it is this long black something or other. I can't actually make out exactly what it is. It's about 18 inches long, and I set it aside, and I start reading the trial records. And the very first case involves a man who was nearly beaten to death by his captain, who used an 18-inch piece of rope for the beating. Mm. And that thing that was lying on top of the documents was actually the evidence that the sailor brought with him. He brought the bloody rope.
Oh, my gosh.
As evidence in his case to try to convict this captain of having beaten him nearly to death. Now, you talk about an electrifying moment in the archive.
Yeah.
Suddenly, what common sailors went through in terms of the brutal discipline that they faced routinely was terrifyingly alive to me in this artifact that was lying right there. So I guess what I would say is that, we really need, you can't rely on the Hollywood version of this history. You need to get out there and get into the sources, read the footnotes. That's how you will really understand why and how people became pirates.
Fantastic. Well, Marcus, this has been super fun. I'm glad we finally got to do this after a couple of aborted attempts.
Okay.
And I appreciate your time.
Okay. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right. Talk to you again soon. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And bam, how's that for starting 2018 off with a bang of some pirate talk, man? That was fantastic. That was Marcus Rediker, author of Villains of All Nations and lots of other books. I'm going to have all of his books linked up in the show notes at underthecrossbones.com/123. And they will, of course, be Amazon links. If you click those Amazon links, Amazon kicks me back a few shekels, and that helps keep the show going. So you get a twofer. A twofer. It's good for you. It's good for me. It's good for Marcus. Good for everybody. I guess that's a threefer if it's anyway. If you want to find out more about Marcus Rediker, go to marcusrediker.com. Marcus with a C, Rediker, Rediker. And of course, that'll be linked up in the show notes as well. We are sponsored today by Pirate Radio, the Treasure Coast, WKKC-DB, playing the best music in pirate radio talk. You can listen to Under the Crossbones on both their stations. Just go to pirateradiothetreasurecoast.com or pirateradiotc.com. And don't forget to download the apps. That's the Pirate Radio Treasure Coast app for the music station, and Pirate Radio Talk is the talk station. That's why the name Talk is in the title of it. And thanks, if you're listening on Pirate Radio right now, welcome to the show. Thanks for tuning in. It's funny because at the end of December or any holiday sort of time, is not known as a large podcast listening time. But apparently some of you pirates were trying to avoid your relatives or something, because we had a ton of listening over the holiday break. So I appreciate that. If you were telling your friends about it and bringing new people into the show, I heartfelt thank you to see you doing that. That is what makes the show grow, and I appreciate that a whole lot. And as a gift, I've got a free ebook for you. It's Alexander Exquemelin's Pirates of Panama, or Buccaneers of America. And this was a book put out in 1678 originally. Alexander Exquemelin was a doctor who ended up on pirate ships and wrote about his experiences on those pirate ships. So this is of the period, first-person adventure-y kind of stuff, and it's as true as far as we know. So if you would like a really nice ebook version of it that I put together for you, go to underthecrossbones.com, click on the free ebook button, and you can grab it there. Or if you're out and about and all you have is your cell phone, you can text the word pirate and your email address to 94253. Just text the word pirate and your email address to 94253. And that is our show for today, friends. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate it a whole bunch. Again, if you want to find out more about Marcus Rediker and the stuff he's up to, go to marcusrediker.com. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, underthecrossbones.com/123. If you want to find out where I'm telling jokes and singing songs, you can go to philjohnsоncomedy.com and find me over there. Got some great episodes coming up for you, some really, really fun ones. We're going to hear from Scarlett Deerhart from Deerhart's Doodads. She's got a great story behind her business. We're going to talk to Eric Nelson and Kirby Hayborn of Pirates of the Great Salt Lake, which if you haven't seen that movie, dig up a copy. It's fun. It's a good one. We got Ted Shred from Pirates for Hire coming up. Lots of great episodes and more coming up. So that's it. That's this week's show. Go out and make yourself useful.